Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Or do I need to do the microphone as well? Okay, you're good. Thank you. I'll do that in case. Okay, now for something completely different. I am an artist, and I guess the connection I'm going to make with you is by suggesting there's an analogy here between the challenges that you have as an artist and the entrepreneurialism. As I was asked to do this talk with this provocation of what if, I took it very literally. So this talk really is about this kind of question. And I think it's a central question both for business as well as for artists. Anybody know who this is? That attractive man? This is David Caleb Lewis. He's an American philosopher. If you look at his dates, he sort of like measures out a very important time in American history from the Pearl Harbor up until 9/11. And he is an analytic philosopher who is probably most known for bringing metaphysics back into philosophy. And he's not trying to bring God in through the back door, and he's not one of those new age kind of meditation kind of persons. He's a logician. He works on hard proofs to philosophical problems. And he thinks a lot about the problem of what if. In fact, he wrote the book, this is philosophical talk, called Counterfactuals, which talks about a branch of logic called modal logic. And this has to do with this kind of question about how we think about what is possible. And he came up with this kind of assertion, which is very controversial, which is called modal realism. So he starts his book with saying, there are many ways things could have been besides the way they actually are. This is fairly non-controversial. We all imagine that we go through life and things could change, that we'll make decisions. The thing that he really kind of broke out with was to say that any way a world could be is as real as the world that we are living in. And so this was the statement that really got what he called the incredulous stare whenever he explained it. So what he is doing philosophically through a kind of logical method is really dissolving this line between the what if and the what is. Now, we can argue with David Lewis, and I'm sure if there's philosophers in the room, we could have a great debate, because it's quite a big assertion that every possible world actually exists in some sort of way. But it does solve certain kind of philosophical problems. But it also is a provocation for us to think about not just dreaming these ideas, but actually sort of imagining that they were as real and tangible and actual as the ones that we actually have in front of us. And in some ways, I feel like one of the things I've tried to do as an artist for many years is dissolve the line between art and science, or at least begin to trouble or find some kind of way in which, as an artist, we can start to see how the methods of art and science sort of get confused in a way. And if we look at the world of art as the kind of world of speculation, the idea of sort of imagination, it somehow feels like it's separated from the world of science, which is about measurement, it's about prediction, it's about figuring out how we can actually know the world in really tangible ways. So I kind of like the gesture that David Lewis is making, that he's actually trying to kind of find a territory that's not floofy at all. It's like based in logic, where we can kind of find the confusions between these areas. So Nietzsche, the philosopher of the 19th century, was also concerned about this kind of relationship. So in his book, The Gay Science, he talks about how we think about science as being a way of describing the world, the way the world is. But he says that we have to have the what-if question before we get to science. Imagination and art comes first. That is, we can't really sort of think about the way in which we have imagined that the world is if we can't imagine it being somewhat different. And this has become part of, that's kind of getting cut off there. Karl Popper, the science philosopher, talks about this idea of falsification. And it's a sort of standard of science by which you have to also be able to prove how our model of the world can be proved false. It's also known as verificationism. And this is a really strong idea in our culture. We have this idea that science sort of exists as a way of really having a reliable grasp of reality. However, I want to show that artists sort of trouble this idea, because increasingly we have started to live in outside of the scientific world in a kind of reality that we pretend is science. We pretend, or we sort of think of it as a sort of pseudo-scientific way of absorbing reality. So Vita Ronell, the cultural theorist, also talks about this idea. In her book, The Test Drive, she talks about how we've overdetermined the idea of testing these models of reality, and that somehow it's sort of warping our ability to actually sort of creatively move forward. Okay, so an example of that, well, let's take sports, for instance. Sports is an area where, it's increasingly become a kind of thing that has become very scientific. We don't go to the ballet, for instance, to find out the score. We go to a sports event, and there seems to be this verifiable way in which we can determine how things are kind of determined. And if we look at my favorite sport, which is cricket, there's even something called Test cricket. This is the highest form of the game. And for those of you who don't know, Test cricket is a 5-day contest where they play for like 9 hours a day. It's a massive kind of operatic kind of form of the sport. So one day in Test cricket, this happened. And can I play the video here? How does that happen? Oops. Uh-oh. What did I do? Hello?
Crowd participation took on a new meaning during the Lord's Test match when the unthinkable happened. Veteran broadcaster John Arlott described the scene.
Oh, Peter. We've got a freaker down the wicket now, not very safely, and it's masculine. And I would think it's seen the last of its cricket for the day. The police have just saw the cameraman, and he's had his nose being replaced by a blonde.
Within a couple of years, the novelty of streakers on the ground has become very irritating.
Okay, so this was the first instance of a streaker at a cricket match. And of course, the thing about this is cricket is a very proper sport. It's like known to be like this very polite, very honorable things. The players wear white. It's this, it sort of symbolizes, all those great characters supposedly of England. And here you have this freaker, as the guy called him, leaping over the stumps. And in some ways we can kind of admire this figure, this person who's willing to kind of get out there and throw himself out. And in fact, it might even remind you of this other kind of gesture, this idea of just do it, And in some ways, this streaker is kind of participating in the sport in a way that's a kind of a parody of it, but it's also participating in it. So it was kind of like sort of seeing how sort of outrageous this was, because not cricket, old chap, is this way in which we say, oh, that's not proper, and there's a sort of bit of British fun in it, I suppose, and all that. But I kind of want to make this freaker into a kind of a model that we can kind of look at as what the artist does. And it helps the fact that his name was actually Michelangelo. And that's really his name. So, it's very easy to see how he exists as a kind of a figure of an artist within this kind of situation. And of course, if you know Michelangelo's work at the Sistine Chapel, he was also somebody who was kind of activating the space with male nudity, although I don't know if that's accurate. Okay. So, there was complaints at the time that Michelangelo was using naked bodies, that, there was oftentimes throughout the years an attempt to censor the Sistine Chapel and so on. And there was really kind of some people who were complaining that he wasn't being serious enough about the act of doing these kind of papal paintings. And in fact, the master of ceremonies to the Pope at the time said that these aren't works that are for a papal chapel, they're for the brothels and for the taverns. So Michelangelo's response was to paint him into the Last Judgment as the Midas, the judge of the underworld, of course, being naked there. So he got his revenge. So one of the things I think that artists do is sort of take up this kind of idea of troubling the circumstances of whether it be sport or religion and so on. Now, the image of Michelangelo has sort of lived on in the history of cricket. It became itself a kind of part of a parody when it became the cover of this album by the Duckworth-Lewis Method for an album called Sticky Wickets. And the Duckworth-Lewis Method, which is a comic duo who does parody songs all based in sort of cricket, that's not actually Duckworth and Lewis. Those of you who know cricket, do you know what it is? Any cricket people out there? Okay. So Lewis and Duckworth are actually two mathematicians. And they were tasked with coming up with a mathematical way of determining a par score for limited over matches. So they determined, like, if a match was kind of interrupted by rain, they wanted to kind of figure out by what was happening on the field and how many wickets they had left and how much time was left in the game, what a par score would be to compete with. And one of the things I want to point out about this is that this is kind of the blurring again of the actual and the projected. In a very subtle way, what's happening here is that we think about sports as being a measurement of something, but as soon as you set a par score, you're predicting what is going to happen in the game. And so without the incredulous stare, we actually fall into these kind of states of being able to kind of accept that our predictions of the world are, in fact, reality. And this is something that was analyzed by Jerry Mueller in this book called The Tyranny of Metrics. And what he points out there is that so often we use metrics, we use these kind of systems of meaning that are based in sort of predictions and probability and so on, to create a kind of false sense of reality in the world. And this is also true with this thing called Goddhart's law. And it's the provocation that when we start to kind of set targets, or when we start to kind of think about goals, or we start to think about predictable results, we start to kind of warp the system, because what inevitably happens is people start to game the system. And the examples of this are like when we sort of emphasize the results of testing in children. What happens is the system adapts, so they start to teach children how to take tests. And they start to discard what actually you're supposed to be testing. There's another more pernicious example of that, which is that the British government started to set targets for people to have successful surgeries. So somebody would start to only accept the possibly successful surgeries that they could do, ignoring people who are perhaps riskier because they knew that they were being judged by a certain kind of standard. So in some ways, I feel like this dissolution of reality, especially when we're sort of thinking that it is kind of scientific, is something that we have to kind of make a gesture against. And we have to recognize that we're living in David Lewis's kind of possible world scenario. And in fact, we need somebody to come along and sort of disrupt that and show us, as this artist Michelangelo does in this case, you know, what we really need to be examining. So the other thing I will say about Michelangelo, our streaker, is that he is probably more truthful to the idea of the test than cricketers are. Because if you look at the word test, it comes from the word testis. And of course that is both the root of testament or witnessing, as well as testicles. And so, you know, this is true because a lot of, in Roman and Greek traditions, there's this tradition of taking an oath on your genitals. It's like you're giving up your reproductive future as a stake in, or an oath to being truthful about it. So in, you know, common parlance then, you know, Michelangelo really has the balls in this situation to kind of stand up and get out there and disrupt the system. And I suppose that's the message, both for artists and for entrepreneurs. Okay, thank you. I'm back up.